When I was 12 years old, I went to a week-long scout camp with my troop. Our campsite was notably isolated from the majority of other sites, so even though there were hundreds of kids at the camp overall, there were probably 5 of us kids and 2 or 3 leaders in our site. I shared a tent with 2 other kids. Being the anti-scout that I was, I brought a full-size cot to sleep on, while the other kids slept on the ground. I'm a horrible sleeper in any conditions, other than my own bed, so I've always taken sleeping pills when I go camping. I sometimes have strange reactions to them, where I don't sleep well and have dreams confused with reality. On our final night at the camp, it was storming with lightning everywhere. We were in a creeped out mood, telling scary stories before trying to go to sleep. I couldn't wait to go home the next morning. I took my pills and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up a few hours into the night. I opened my eyes, and in the darkness, I could barely make out the crouched over figure of a tall man. I'd woken up because he was gently grabbing my leg. He didn't look like any of my leaders from what I could tell. Confused and groggy and horrified, I said, "What?" The figure remained silent. After a week on these sleeping pills, I knew how they could make me confused. I closed my eyes hoping that it was just the pills combined with the night of scary stories. I felt the gentle grip on my leg once again. The figure was still standing there. "What?" I said again, this time a little more panicked. Suddenly, still without a word, the man leaned down onto the ground next to me, where I couldn't see because I was elevated. I couldn't hear anything strange happening, but I was filled with so much terror that I couldn't even bring myself to peek over the edge of my cot. I was still unbelievably tired and confused, and in my frightened stupor, I convinced myself that the sleeping pills were causing me to blend nightmares with reality. I drifted in and out of a horrified semi-sleep for the rest of the night, wondering what really had happened. I never recalled hearing anything notable or seeing the man leave the tent. Once the sun began to dimly light the tent, I mustered the courage to look over the edge of the cot. The kid next to me was fast asleep and appeared to be unharmed. If this were all there was to the story, I would dismiss it as a weird reaction to my sleeping pills. But then the next morning over breakfast, the kid who had been next to me fucking asked me, and our tent mate, if somebody had come into our tent overnight. The other tent mate said he had assumed one of us was going to pee and had gone back to sleep. When we all confirmed that none of us had gotten up in the night, we started freaking out, begging our leaders and the other scouts for them to admit that one of them had played a joke on us, or that they had a history of sleepwalking. Nobody ever had any idea what we were talking about. I don't know what someone's motives would have been to come into our tent only to gently touch my leg and be silent. Unless I have some serious mental blocks, there was no kind of sexual violation that I can recall. Just a strange, quiet intruder. Story number 2. So one summer a few years ago, my friend and her boyfriend, now husband, decided to go to Ontario to visit friends and family. While we were there, we made the decision to camp over the weekend by one of the many lakes scattered throughout the province. One campground they had been directed to by friends was beautiful but absolutely packed with holiday goers, and if you're anything like them or myself, you find the more solitude provided by the campground, the better. So they chose instead to head down the road a little further, where they had seen signs for another campground. The new site was breathtaking, she said, absolutely stunning with huge maple trees and a sandy beach, with the waves lapping gently on the shore. However, it was completely empty. Not a single camper or tent in the entire place. They just couldn't understand why people were choosing to shove themselves into a packed campground, while another perfectly acceptable location was just a few kilometers, down the road. They didn't mention much more of it after that, and simply paid for the night and set up a tent while going about their evening business. We hung out around the fire, talking of the lovely surroundings. She told me they went to bed roughly at 11:30 p.m., just after dark. My coworker awoke in the middle of the night to a strange feeling. She knew something was wrong but couldn't put her finger on it immediately in her sleepy haze. She lay there in the pitch black for a while, and rather than drifting back to sleep, her feeling of unease grew as she was pulled further awake. Suddenly she realized what was wrong. There was breathing, extra breathing. Not that of herself or her boyfriend, but the sound of someone else just beyond the walls of their tent. She lay quietly for a second, making sure what she heard wasn't only in her imagination. Fear gripping her heart and taking her breath from her lungs. Slowly and quietly she shook her boyfriend awake, urging him to be silent. He gripped her hand as he too heard the sound of another person outside the tent. Both of them had no idea what to do. Sure, they could emerge from the tent and confront the person, but what if there was more than one hiding in the dark? What if they had a weapon? My coworker and her boyfriend didn't have anything to defend themselves with, other than basic camping necessities. So they spent the night wide awake, while whoever was standing just beyond the protection of the tent breathed easily, occasionally moving from one side of the shelter to the other, but never doing more than just lurking around. The next morning as the sun came up, they heard footsteps of someone slowly walking away from the tent. They immediately packed all of their belongings and left the site, now having a very good idea of why such a lovely campsite had been so incredibly empty. On their way out, they informed the owner of the campground of their nighttime visitor. It was an elderly couple who had claimed to have no idea who it could have been, or why someone would spend the entire night watching their tent. Regardless, they left quickly and never went back. To this day, she still says it was one of the most unsettling and scary nights of her life. Creepy camper, I'm glad I've never met you, and I'd like to keep it that way. Story number 3. My sister was telling me this story that happened to her sometime last year. We live in Australia, and my sister, her boyfriend, and some other friends of hers went for a camping holiday in Tasmania. They had hired camper vans to get around and were driving in a pretty rural area, basically in the middle of nowhere. My sister and her friends found a nice beach and decided to camp there for the night. It was 4 or 5 o'clock when they were settled. A van was already parked on the beach before them, roughly 40 meters away, but that stage they didn't care. They did notice, though, that a figure which looked like a man was sitting in the back seat of the van completely still and didn't seem to be moving around much, except for some small motions. Once again, they weren't too worried, and they thought it was some random guy perving on them while they were at the beach. As it grew darker and later, a friend of my sister started to get a little paranoid. After all, this guy had been sitting there for a couple of hours now, just staring at them. They had come up with several theories as to what this guy was up to, if he needed help or something, or if this guy was just plain old fucked up. It was 10 o'clock now, and everyone was getting very nervy, and people were thinking about driving off and finding another place to spend the night, but they decided to stay a little longer. One of them was feeling pretty brave, so he went up to the van with a flashlight, at a distance while the others shone the headlights into the van to take a closer look. So they saw this guy just sitting still, with heaps of sheets of weird black plastic everywhere, in the back seat with him. In the end, everyone was just too creeped out, so they eventually drove off. But to this day, nobody knows what he was doing there, or planning to do. Trust me, it sounded a lot more scary when she was telling me, so I'm just trying to recount the story. I don't know about you guys, but this experience sounds very freaky, being so mysterious and all, and I was very scared from what she told me. Story number 4. This happened to myself and a close friend, both 23-year-old males, just last month. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking, camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We are both very comfortable with nature and spend a lot of time camping, hunting, and fishing. We hiked 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area, and we did not expect to run into anyone. Our first night there, as we were sitting around the fire, we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake around 10:30. This was fairly unusual, however, we didn't think much of it. But as time went on, the flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night, and we did not particularly want any unwelcome guests. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading for our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who wandered up. I took a small axe with me, and my friend had a .22 rifle. Now, we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. Now, the moment of truth. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and it is one man. He has a beard and probably is in his mid-40s. The scary part was he was carrying what turned out to be a pumped shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times, and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling, "I know you're out there. Why don't you come and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree 50 yards away. This is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire, threw them in to burn. My friend, who had trained the .22 at the man, asked me if he should shoot. I told him absolutely not unless he spots us and starts to point the gun in our direction. Thankfully, the man moved off from where he had come after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake, ran out, grabbed everything we could fit in our pack, and took off around 2 or 3 a.m. We ran out the trail with flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported the situation, where we also spoke with some forest rangers. That was it. I haven't heard anything back from the police. It wasn't mysterious. However, it creeped the hell out of both of us. I've backpacked in the Rockies of Colorado for over 40 years. I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck a few times, usually just before I see fresh mountain lion tracks. By far the weirdest thing I've seen in the wilderness was back in the late 1970s, not far from Crystal, Colorado. I was backpacking with 2 friends, and we were camped on a ridge overlooking a wooded valley south and a little east of Crystal. It was not far from Treasury Mountain. Just before dark, my friends and I noticed a camp of approximately 8 to 10 people on the far side of the valley, about a mile or so as a crow flies. They had a blue tarp erected and were standing around it. Suddenly, they all seemed to realize we were looking at them, and they went under the blue tarp. I remember all 3 of us thought this was very eerie, since we were quite a ways away from them, and in trees. We didn't think they could have seen us. We didn't think much more about it until it was dark, probably around 10 p.m. or so. I looked across the valley and saw lights moving quickly up and down the valley. They appeared to be moving much more quickly than a person could walk, or even run through trees and over rough terrain. It was very, very weird. I remember one of the lights that came towards us seemed to be above the trees. It appeared to come about halfway across the valley towards us, then went out. We didn't hear anything. It was absolutely quiet that night. None of us slept too soundly. I got out of my tent at first light looked across the valley where the blue tarp was, and it was gone. Never did find out what those people were up to, but there were rumors around the area back then about cults and weird stuff happening. Two-legged critters creep me out way more than the four-legged ones. Story number 2. I've gone hiking and camping alone since my childhood. I've had some interesting experiences, most of them being good ones. Some a little scary, but nothing that would keep me from going out alone. I'm comfortable in the wild. I welcome the wolf and I respect the bear. I have a healthy fear of cats, but really love the rare occasions I see one. There is, however, one place I won't go alone. I was 20 living in a small college town on the front range of the Rockies. Went for a hike up the canyon west of town to enjoy a little solitude and Mother Nature. I spotted a nice rock formation protruding from the dense pines near the top of the canyon wall. Took a while, but it was a nice, cool hike among the trees. The forest was very quiet. I saw well-used deer trails and found warm deer scat. I saw bear scat and scratches on trees. I saw a kill site where a mountain lion took a deer, old enough that coyotes had gotten to the remains, but clearly cats were in the area. I settled into a little cradle formed by the rocks. I had a cigarette and drink, planning to wait a while for the local fauna to forget my presence and go about its business. I couldn't get over this feeling of being watched. It seemed somehow different than the times I've been around large cats or bears. Played the waiting game for about 45 minutes, being completely still. I stared blankly into the woods, allowing my sense to be open to the smallest sign. Nothing. Just eerie silence, and that feeling. Since my watcher wasn't in any hurry to give up their identity, I decided to change tactics. Drawing my Bowie knife, I sprang to my feet, hearing the slightest whoosh from the ridge above. I turned just enough to catch a shadow with the corner of my eye. Cautiously and quietly, I pursued the form, catching fleeting glimpses here and there as I followed it to the top of the ridge. No color or definable shape to give its identity. No tracks left in the soft, dark, muddy ground. Just shadow. The top of the canyon wall opened to a small clearing and the remains of a turn-in-the-century cabin. The shadowy form disappeared into the structure that was still standing. There was an old iron stove and part of a stone chimney, collapsing walls of decomposed logs sitting on a crumbling foundation. I circled around, giving a wide berth to where I could see inside. There was nothing. Slowly I approached and went in. As I stood in the skeleton of that old cabin, the feeling of that unseen presence being somewhere out there changed to a feeling of it being all around me. I put my knife away, believing it was no bear or lion that stalked me, and then I ran like the wind. Story number 3. I've been an archery hunter for 20 years. We usually go into the woods a couple of hours before sunrise and put up our portable tree stands and wait for first light. We had scouted a new site and marked stand trees with reflective markers since we usually hunted the morning hunt. I remember finding the half-buried foundation of an old house, made from blue stone and mortar. I guessed it to be mid-lower 1800s. There were signs of a barn and an old apple tree, still putting out wormy fruit. You could tell this had been a small farm. We gave ourselves extra time to get to our spot, but we got there earlier than we thought, around 0300 hours. I put up my stand and sat in the mid-October coolness of the night, listening to the night sounds of the woods. I know the death screams of rabbits. I know the lonely calls of feral dogs and coyotes. I've heard most everything in the woods at night that swims, flies, or goes on 4 feet. I remember getting this slow unease creeping upon me, My sweat ran cold down my spine, and I began to look around, trying to identify what was making me so tense. My mind began to put form and shapes to every tree and clump of bushes. My heart rose into my throat. There were no animal sounds. The night was so still, and then the half moon came from behind the clouds. The sound started immediately. Behind my stand about 20 yards out, it sounded like screams, but not ripped from anything human. It slowly moved through the woods, but not crashing or breaking sticks or rustling leaves. The screams slowly moved around me, coming from ground level, but nothing was visible, always just out of my sight or invisible. I was terrified to the point I could not move. I wanted to get down out of that stand and run away, anywhere but there. It was driving me mad. I had to get away. I wanted to jump the 20 feet to the ground and risk a broken leg just to get as far away as I could. The scream continued. It seemed like forever, slowly half circumventing the small clearing I had my stand in. The sound would rise and fall, sometimes choking off then resuming a second later. It moved slowly down the hill towards my brother's stand, not abating or ceasing. There were no sounds other than the screaming, no sounds of struggle, just the unbelievably loud screams of terror and torment. I heard it go down into the hollow where my brother was, then up the far side of the gully and up the mountain, and then fade away into nothing. When the sound ends, I realize that 2 hours had passed, and it was coming up to shooting hours. I could move again, but I was shaking. I opened my water bottle and drank some water, nearly choking on it. I waited, trying to calm down. Finally, I was calm enough to get down out of the tree stand. I waited with my gear ready to bolt. My brother came up from the bottom just as I was finishing. The sun was just poking over the horizon. It was still prime hunting hours, but he had heard it too. "What the hell was that?" he asked me. "I do not know, and I'm not hanging around to find out." I hefted the stand to my shoulder and started up the deer path that ran behind my stand tree. I told my brother, "It started just over there." That's when we noticed the 3 headstones from the farmer's family plot. We never hunted there again. Story number 4. January 28, 1959. 10 students from the Yuri Polytechnic Institute in Solomonsk, Russia, set out on an expedition into the Ural Mountains, specifically Orten Mountain. Igor Dyatlov, the expedition's leader, promised to return by February 12, 1959. One of the team members, Yuri Yudin, fell ill near Vizhaj, the last city before the base of the mountain. The other 9 went on never to return alive. Yudin awaited word from his friends. Dyatlov confided that may take longer than the estimated time, so when no word came from the group on the 12th, no one worried. When no word had come by February 20th, however, the families of the missing expeditionists demanded a search. On February 26, 1959, the report came back. The tent had been found with 2 gaping holes in the side, big enough for people to crawl through. It had been cut out from the inside. Evidence in the snow and tent indicated that the party had left in a great hurry and were either barefoot or in socks. All of them had been dressed in just their sleepwear. All of them had been running into the direction of the woods. 3 of the bodies were found closer to the camp, as if they were trying to return. They were identified and determined to have died of hypothermia. 2 more were discovered at the edge of the woods, also dead of hypothermia. One of the 5 had evidence of a skull fracture, but it was determined to be non-fatal. All of the bodies were noted as having an unnatural orange tan, and all of the hair turned gray. 4 remained unfound. The search continued for 2 months. Finally, in May, the other 4 were found under 4 meters of snow, which is about 12 feet. The autopsy determined that one of these 4 died of hypothermia. The other 3, however, had some rather traumatic internal injuries. One had a crushed skull. The other 2 had crushed ribs, and one of those still was missing her tongue. Much more to read. Just research the Dyatlov Pass incident. Story number 5. A couple of years ago in 2003, my friend Archie and his uncle Matt went for an overnight cruise on Matt's boat, which is a 20-foot power boat, big enough to have the sleeper on the front, along St. Mary's River, between Lake Superior and Lake Huron. Matt has his native status card, so the plan is to camp on one of the islands belonging to the reservation. The island they find Matt knows a little history on, in that it was given to the reserve about 40 years ago. All of the people who had cabins on this island pretty much had to pack up and leave. So they landed there around supper time, explore some of the cabins which were in varying states of decay, as they had not been touched since being vacated for the most part. Archie says the coolest thing he has ever seen was glass that has warped or sagged with age. There wasn't any empty food cans, fresh deer kills, etc., as in the stories here. They decide, instead of staying in the boat anchored on the shore, they'll just hang out in one of those old cabins. They find one quickly that has fared well and no basement to fall into. So they fire up a little propane barbecue out front, roll out the sleeping bags, and crack open some wobbly pops. After a good few, the sun has gone down and they are both getting ready to turn in. Archie looks out the rear window, and holy crap, there are other people camping here too. Archie recalls very clearly seeing 3 people sitting at a healthy bonfire, roughly 40 feet away near the cabin. Even the lawn between here and there is somewhat kept. Archie and Matt decide they better go say hello. They walk out the back door, into almost chest-high grass and complete darkness. No bonfire in sight. My cousins live in North Dakota, and I spent the winter break there freshman year in college. We were at a friend's house one night, drinking in her basement with some girls. It was really late, around 3 a.m. I was falling asleep, so I decided to walk home. They live in a desolate area with lots of snow, and it gets very cold, especially at night, but the houses weren't too far apart, and when the moon is out it seems light. The path we always take is straight behind the house through some wooded areas, then more open land. I was shuffling home through the snow with my head down. I look up and to my left at 10 o'clock, probably 75 yards away, is another figure walking in the opposite direction. I saw him a split second before he saw me, and when he did, he kind of jerked his arms and shoulders up a little, obviously startled from the sight of me, as I was of him. I laughed out loud for some reason, just from shock or something, and gave him a little wave like, "Oh, you startled me. Haha, sorry." He just stood there and stared at me. I thought he was going to say something for a second, and so I was stopped to just look at him. He had a full face ski mask on, and I could tell it was a dude because he was very tall, but he didn't say anything. So for what felt like forever, it's just me and some stranger in a ski mask, looking at each other in the desolate woods, in the middle of winter, at 3 a.m. A huge chill went up my spine and a voice said, "You need to get the fuck out of here, right now." I turned and started walking as fast as I could home. I've never been that scared in my life. I was a little drunk, stoned, and very paranoid. I imagined me walking home from the opposite perspective, and the man is running up from behind with an axe. So I literally just screamed and started sprinting as fast as I could all the way home, thinking that this guy could easily follow my tracks in the snow, and then I'm going to get murdered. Luckily I didn't, but I don't think I'll be visiting those woods again anytime soon. Story number 2. I'm not sure if it counts as another human being, because we didn't positively identify anyone, but a few years ago my friends and I were staying in a small cabin. My dad had a cabin on a remote piece of land in the Idaho wilderness. The nearest town was probably 50 miles away, and the nearest active road that wasn't an old logging road was about 2 miles from the cabin. My friend and I had been bullshitting and laughing in the cabin in our bunks, and it was about midnight. We had turned off the lantern and were trying to fall asleep when we heard something that sounded like something had scraped the door. We both lifted our heads up and mumbled a conversation of, "Did you hear something?" "Yeah." Then, in the middle of nowhere in this remote cabin, someone starts knocking on the door. Doesn't say anything, just knocks. We were both in our 30s, but we were so scared shitless we didn't say anything. We just lay there with our heads up, staring at the door. We didn't go out until it was light again, and there was nothing near the door that would have tapped against it, and no animal tracks. It freaks me out even thinking about it. Story number 3. I camped in Northern California with a couple friends for 3 months straight in 2012. We are talking way out into the wilderness. The whole trip was a great success until we were heading south again. We set up camp a few miles outside a tiny town as it was getting dark. The only things in this town were one long road, a gas station, a post office, and a bar. In the middle of the night, we hear screaming off in the distance. We could discern 3 different voices, but they were far enough away we couldn't quite make out what was being said. All of a sudden, we hear a single gunshot, followed by absolute silence. I opened my tent and looked over at my friends who were looking back at me. None of us said a word. We laid back down and tried to sleep. Scariest night of my life. A lot of people wondered if we reported this to the police. What police? You need to understand that in this area, one sheriff patrols 3 counties. That's it. This area of Cali is what Sons of Anarchy was based on. I know that was a TV show and was dramatized, but there is some truth to what goes on in these areas. The sheriff is most likely in the pockets of the drug runners. It is in your best interest to put your head down, mind your own damn business, unless you want to be the next. We were kids with no resources, backpacks and tents, hitchhiking through the Northwest. It would have been so easy to make us disappear next. Story number 4. A friend and I were scoping out an area for hiking because we were both new to the area. It was probably 6 p.m. but pitch black because it was the dead of winter when it gets dark at 4 p.m. We drove down a dead-end dirt road to try to find a trailhead we had heard about. The road is probably 2 to 3 miles long, and we don't see anything on our way down. We get to the dead end and turn around to head back out to the main road. About halfway from the dead end to the main road, we see a man standing at the edge of the road in tattered clothes and covered in dirt carrying a shovel, staring us down. My friend and I both held our breath until we were back in town and asked each other if we saw the same thing. Story number 5. A trail I liked backpacking in an isolated area of Pennsylvania was the setting for this odd encounter. The trail has a short section that goes over someone's cabin's property and continues on the other side of his yard. It's marked with an orange blaze so you can see where to go. Usually it's an empty cabin. I always do some peering inside since it's a pretty secluded spot, probably 4 or 5 miles from a main road. One time I was hiking through, and there's a large man grilling outside with about 15 Bud Light cans on the ground around him. I distinctly remember him saying, "Keep it moving, no food here," which I thought was funny since I didn't say anything about needing food. Fast forward the following year and I decided to take my sister, my wife, and her best friend on a trip that takes us through this very spot. As we are walking up on it, I see the dude is there again, which is odd, since I've hiked the trail 100 times, and this is only twice I've seen him. He's grilling again, beer cans everywhere. I can see him start to give the keep it moving signal till he sees who I'm with. Now, the girls I'm traveling with are attractive, so I'm nervous all of a sudden. He asks us to stay for dinner, says he has plenty of extra food. I tell him no, we're good, just trying to enjoy the trail away from the comforts of home. He gets weirdly pushy about us staying, and I firmly say no thanks, and that we are just passing through. I hear the dude mumble to himself as we continue past the house. This is where things get weird. There is a prominent camping spot not far from this section of the trail, and it's late in my head. I want to keep going because I don't want to camp near this asshole. The consensus is everyone is pretty tired, so we set up camp. I'm nervous the whole time, thinking this drunk man knows there are 3 women camping in tents near his cabin. I never get nervous around people I see on the trail, because everyone is usually very nice and wonderful to talk to. This guy just felt off to me though. Fast forward to the middle of the night, and sure enough I hear someone on the trail outside the tent. I'm just praying it's a bear at this point, but I hear the dude mumbling to himself and I panic. I hear him now in the camp. He's going through our shit and is pissed drunk. Fuck. Okay, think. I realize I have a blowhorn on my pack I use on the trail to scare animals off. So I unzip the tent and slowly roll out. Dude is fumbling around and it's scary as hell, because it's the middle of the darkness in the middle of nowhere. I start to run towards him and blow my air horn repeatedly, and it's loud as shit. Everyone in their tent starts screaming. The dude nearly shits his pants and starts bumbling the fuck out of there. Everyone is so shaken up at this point. We pack up and night hike out of there. Worst experience I've ever had. Story number 5. I was on my wife's family ranch, which is about 1,000 acres. I was scouting deer as it was deer season. I had my rifle slung on my back as I was walking through the woods. As I walk out of the woods onto one of 2 dirt roads into the property, I saw 2 strangers sitting on the back bed of their white pickup truck. They had rifles in their hands. I approached them with a friendly wave. As I approached them, I kept my rifle slung on my back so not to threaten them. I asked them how they were doing and what they were hunting. They said they were doing fine and looking for deer. I then noticed 6 or 7 beer cans on the ground. They asked me the same thing, and I told them that I was good in scouting deer as well. Here comes the hard part. I asked them how they got onto the property. They began to mumble and asked me the same question. I politely told them that my wife's family owns the property. I then told them they should leave. I told them to have a great day and started walking backwards. After about 20 yards, I turn around and start walking very briskly. I heard one shot in my direction. I hit the ground behind a bush and another shot rings out. I hear that whiz. I immediately position myself to fire on them. I see one guy packing up his gun into the back bed of the truck. I take aim at his right leg and fire. I get up and start running into the woods. I hear screaming. After 20 minutes, I get back to my Tahoe, call the game warden and the local sheriff. They come out after about 30 minutes and these poachers were gone. I told them all the details and descriptions and said I think I shot one of them in the leg. The next day I get a call from the sheriff saying they had a guy in the local ER with a gunshot wound to the leg. He sent me a picture via text, and it was the guy I shot. He survived and got 4 years in prison because that was his first felony. They never found the other guy. Story number 6. I used to often spend my summers bouldering with my friends by a relatively large forest that was about an hour and a half away from where I used to live. We used to spend some of the nights camping out there just to save some travel costs and time. Anyway, I think this was roughly like the third or fourth time we were out there camping. My friend had left all her climbing gear in her rucksack just outside her tent, or we definitely thought she did anyway. The next morning we found her boots, a few clothes, and all her chalk powder had disappeared. We figured that it could have been completely feasible that she had misplaced it, although we were quite sure that they were next to her tent. We didn't really want to believe that they were stolen. Anyway, we didn't read too much into this and just stupidly said to ourselves that perhaps she had left it by the boulders and some animal took an interest. I know it sounds stupid, but it was very reasonable to us at the time. Anyway, fast forward a year. We're at the same spot as usual, sitting by the tents and chilling after having some food. Mind you, it is pitch black outside, and only the camp area is lit by fire. I go somewhere a bit out of sight for a slash, and what do I see? A dude in a full ghillie suit laying on his stomach, looking right towards our campsite. I stand there frozen as this man clocks that I have seen him, and he just bolts it out of there. I don't know whether the event to the year prior was related to the ghillie guy, but this definitely has stuck to all of us. We haven't been back there since, which is a damn shame. Story number 1. In my own opinion, reality is far more terrifying than fiction. Let me explain what I mean. My father and I are avid outdoorsmen and fishermen. We have been since I was old enough to walk. I'm a 25-year-old male, and my father just recently turned 50 years old. We live in rural Kentucky near the mountains, and make a plan of going out camping and fishing at least one time per month. Weather be damned. The trip I speak of happened last week and forever changed our lives. My dad has a large Dodge Ram pickup truck with a nice canopy that we pack our gear into each time out. This truck has been in the family for nearly 20 years now. My dad loves his old beat-up truck. It has seen us through many great adventures. We left for our trip at 5 a.m. right before sunup. I fell asleep shortly after we headed out. 2 hours go by and I wake up and notice we are parked in an old rundown gas station, and it's still fairly dark outside. My dad must be inside, I think to myself. I wipe the sleep from my tired and dry eyes to see my dad walking back from the bathroom at the back side of the gas station. The bathroom is about 60 feet from where we are currently parked. As Dad makes his way into my sight line, I notice there is a large man in a black trench coat and cowboy hat following him closely. I roll down the window and yell at my dad to hurry up and get back to the truck. As he perks his head up to listen to what I said, the dark figure rushes my dad and bumps into him from behind. Time froze in that moment, and I blinked my eyes for one moment. When I opened them, I saw my dad fall to the ground and the large man sprint away towards a small forest that butted up against the old rundown station. I ran to my dad, who was now bleeding from his lower back. He told me that the man stabbed him one time, and one time only, then ran away. I was able to get Dad back into the truck, and I used my t-shirt and hoodie to wrap his wound as tight as possible to slow the bleeding. We peeled out of the station lot and I called 911, told the dispatcher what had happened while we were heading to the hospital. Dad kept telling me, "David, why did he stab me? Why did he stab me?" As I peeled into the ER parking lot, Dad passed out in the passenger seat. I thought, please God, not today, not my dad. The hospital staff rushed out to get Dad immediately. After the dust settled, my father made it out okay. He had suffered a lacerated kidney that required major surgery to repair the damage, but he made a full recovery. One of the police officers said they caught the man shortly after he stabbed my dad. Apparently, one person driving by saw the incident and phoned the police and gave chase after the man fled into the woods. The man was a deranged criminal with a laundry list of violent and heinous crimes. My dad and I both carry concealed weapons after that day, and will never be as vulnerable as that day, ever again. Story number 2. Summer of 2018 was absolutely insane. My friends and I always go for a big beer and barbecue camping bash late into the summer. We all live in Denver, Colorado, and are all about the outdoors and anything extreme sports-wise. We decided to rent a large RV camper for the summer trip of 2018. My friends and I all pooled our funds together to spend our week in comfort and bliss. We found a great newer park to hook up our utilities to. We got all settled in for our summer adventure. In total, there were 4 people, including myself, that went on this trip. We were all 22 years old and fresh out of university, so partying and having fun was in our blood. The RV park we stayed at had about 30 campsites equipped for overnight access. On to the night that it happened. The time was roughly 1:30 a.m., and the park was dead silent. My friends and I were all passed out and dead to the world. I woke up to the sound of a thunderous banging noise on the front door of our camper. My friends and I all sprung into action and hopped up out of our beds. I crept up to the door very slowly and deliberately. The pounding knock came once more. I'm a big man at 6'5", 240 pounds, and can handle myself in a fair fight. I used the deepest and most authoritative voice I could muster and yelled, "What do you want?" No response came, and all fell silent in the camper. I looked at my buddies and they shrugged their shoulders in disbelief. Seconds later, a loud banging sound echoed through the camper. Next, another loud banging sound came at the other side of the camper, and then on the back door area as well. My friends and I agreed that we were being surrounded, and whoever was outside of our RV was trying to flank us and do us harm. All of the blinds were shut, and each one of us peeped outside to get a better look. We saw 4 large men in Jason masks holding torches. At this very moment, it felt as if time was literally standing still and things were going in slow motion. As soon as I locked eyes with one man, he raised up a large stick with a white thick cloth wrapping the tip of the stick. The man lit the torch and waved, ran off. I'm not sure how much time went by after he ran. I turned around to see the back window shatter in the RV. The RV was now engulfed in flames, and our lives were literally hanging in the balance. My friend grabbed for the fire extinguisher, but before he could reach it, another torch came flying through another window. At this point, the temperature and smoke was so intense. All I was thinking about was making it out alive. Once all of us guys were safely out of the inferno, we all took time to collect ourselves. Neighboring campers surrounded the area and were checking on us. The police and fire department showed up within minutes. My friends and I spent years in therapy to try and work through what we experienced that night. We never found out who those men were or why they did what they did. Update. After we made it out of the camper, my friend noticed a huge message in blood on our back camper wall. The message simply read, "Die, die, die." Story number 3, my friends. Since summer is almost here, I thought I would share my scary story. I've been a solo camper for many years of my life. I'm a 22-year-old female and I spend more time outdoors than anyone else I know. I grew up with only my father involved in my life, and he was a mountain man type guy. I know how to sustain and live off the land and my environment in any forest type scenario. I currently live in the Pacific Northwest and went out to the Gifford Pinchot National Forest on my most recent trip. Day 1 includes me getting up at 4 a.m. and packing my Jeep Wrangler and getting my German Shepherd ready for travel. I always take my dog Anna with me on each trip. She is a 4-year-old 60-pound German Shepherd and is very protective and well-trained. I arrive at a very secluded location, about 3 to 4 miles into the woods. After I parked my vehicle, I planned to hike in another 2 miles into no man's land. There shouldn't be anyone out here besides my dog and myself. This far off the grid takes skills and knowledge of the landscape to be safe and successful camping-wise. I packed everything I needed for the weekend on my back, and my dog carried in her own pack which held her food and water for the duration of our time here. I set up camp and cooked some food over the fire and did my best to get my dog and I settled in for the weekend. I fell asleep around 10 p.m. and must have woken up 4 or 5 times throughout the night from random sounds from the forest. As I was about to roll over in my tent and get some more shut-eye, I heard a large branch snap about 20 feet behind me. Anna started growling this deep guttural growl and showing her teeth. She was a former police dog in the canine unit and is a super dog in that aspect. I laid in my sleeping bag as quiet as possible and then heard another twig break in the other direction as the first. I don't believe in guns, so all I had with me was a medium-sized camping knife. I called out, "My dog is a trained attack dog, and I will let her go if you don't leave now." 10 long seconds go by, and I hear a low, deep laugh echo throughout the forest. A moment later, my dog broke through her harness and rushed into the dark night. I yelled for her to come back to me. I heard a yelping sound and then a loud scream, I assumed from the laughing man. I yelled for her again. She came back with her mouth dripping with blood. Anna must have attacked the man and bit him good, because there was so much blood. I decided to quickly pack up our stuff and get the hell out of there as soon as possible. I had my pack on and Anna in tow, and then I hear twigs snapping again behind us. We were being chased. I exploded with adrenaline in that moment and basically pulled my dog out of that forest and never looked back. I got to my car, and all of the windows had been broken out. I threw everything in the car and peeled out of that parking lot. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Please be sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe for future content. Email your true scary stories to thesinfulsavant@gmail.com. I will leave a link to my email in the description box below as well. If you guys want this horror channel to continue, I need stories. And comment below your theme ideas as well for upcoming videos. I want your guys' input. Until we meet again, stay sinful.